this religious awakening that was occurring, and the schools and colleges in the New World that we had, like we talked about the ones in New England, the Ivy League schools, Brown, Dartmouth, Yale, Harvard, Columbia, they were not necessarily created for, cranking out young professionals and attorneys, and they were mainly concerned with educating people to go into the ministry, to be preachers. They were religious institutions, and they were training people for religion. Now, Puritan New England, largely for religious reasons, was more, they had a greater interest in education than any of the other colonies, mainly because it stressed the need for Bible reading by individual worshipers. And in order to read the Bible, you have to be literate, and so education was necessary for that. So the primary goal of these institutions was to make clergy, and clergy was to make good Christians, create people that were good at being Christians as opposed to being good citizens. So education really flourished in New England for boys. Sorry, ladies, you were not allowed. But almost from the outset, New England boasted an impressive number of graduates, and these people went on to be ministers and played a large role in the Great Awakening. And just the very nature of education being valued, there's going to a larger number of primary schools and secondary schools grew throughout New England. Some of these schools were tax supported, meaning the people in the community chipped in and paid the teacher and built a schoolhouse and supported the supply. The people in the community chipped in. It was taxes. Other places, they were privately operated. And this is all basically in the North. The South, with its white and black population diffused over very wide areas, was severely handicapped logistically in attempting to establish effective school systems. When you have one white family living on a plantation with 300 slaves, and you own 160,000 acres, you don't just walk to school, because it might be a 6-mile walk across your property, not to mention to get to a village or a town. And so there's not going to be an establishment of a lot of schools in rural areas. So basically what these plantation owners in the South did would just pay tutors to live with them. And they would have teachers that stayed in their mansion or build them separate quarters. And this is for wealthy families. What if you're a poor family? You don't get an education. So maybe if you're lucky enough that mom or dad know how to read, they might teach you. But chances are, mom and dad don't know how to read and write either. Therefore, I'm not saying people in the South are dumber. I'm saying they had less opportunity for education. And if you were very well-to-do in the South, people would send their children overseas to English institutions to learn. That's only for your wealthiest. But for the purposes of convenience and economy, there were the first colleges that were established in the New World in the colonial era: Harvard, William and Mary, and then you got Yale, Princeton. Today we just call it Penn, but it's Pennsylvania University. It's an Ivy League school. Columbia, Brown, Rutgers in New Jersey. Not an Ivy League school, but it's very old. And Dartmouth. So, at these schools, our school here at Independence is larger than the largest one of these schools at that time. Many of they had like 200 students at one time. And instruction was pretty poor by present day standards, if I say so myself. So, the curriculum was still heavily loaded with theology. You guys know what theology is? Yeah, it's religious studies. the particular religious study that they were studying was Christianity, and in New England it was Puritanism, Puritan Christianity. A lot of this theology was heavily loaded in Latin, which is a dead language, meaning it's not that it can't be spoken, it just means that it's not an actively spoken language by any particular nation. But that was pretty much the role of these schools was to train ministers. Okay, questions on that. The first civilized American. I put civilized in quotation marks. Why did I do that? What do I mean by that? Is he really the first civilized American? No, of course not. But many Europeans see him as that. Americans, in the eyes of Europeans, we're all just a bunch of hillbilly, backwards country folk. Even people from like New York were hillbilly, backwards country folk because you are from America. That's why Americans in general are called the Yankees. We are the Yankees. Okay, even though we think Yankees and we think people from New York are in the north. To Europeans, we're all Yankees. In that the word Yankee comes from a Dutch word meaning like rube, backwards person who's awkward and inadequate. All right? So the first person who really gains worldwide fame as being sophisticated, intelligent, knowledgeable, civilized was Benjamin Franklin. Very good, Cooper. He's very versatile, often referred to as the first civilized American. And he also shown as a literary light, among other things. I mean, his autobiography is a classic, but he was best known in his day by his contemporaries for a book called Poor Richard's Almanac. It's not a book, it's a periodical. It was published periodically. Like you get a subscription to Sports Illustrated, it comes once a week. Poor Richard's Almanac's very much like that. I think it was done monthly, or maybe every other month. I can't really remember, but it's a periodical. And he was the editor for this from 1732 to 1758, and it made him one of the wealthiest people in America. This publication contained a lot of pithy sayings, P-I-T-H-Y, pithy. And these sayings emphasized virtues like thrift and hard work and being industrious. Obviously, morality, even though Benjamin Franklin himself, not the most moral human. And common sense. Common sense. You yourself have probably heard many of these sayings, not knowing that they were originated by Benjamin Franklin in Poor Richard's Almanac. Like, honesty is the best policy. Have you ever heard that? Yeah. That's a Benjamin Franklin saying. Or there's only two things guaranteed in life. Death and taxes. That's Benjamin Franklin. Okay, he said these things, and there's dozens more. I just can't think of any off the top of my head, but there's a lot more, and they were just pithy little sayings that have a moral, or they try to teach citizenry something, and even people in Europe subscribed to Poor Richard's Almanac, and it was probably next to the Bible the most read thing in America. Next to the Bible. So Franklin had a great deal of influence in shaping American character and culture. Another thing that Benjamin Franklin did, other than Poor Richard's Almanac, was he liked science. He was very much in science, rising above the shackles of superstition. He's living in a time not far removed from the Salem witch trials, with superstitiousness. And he was beginning to make some progress. But Benjamin Franklin was perhaps the only first-rank scientist the American colonies had. We had scientists, a few botanists for growing things, mathematicians, astronomers. They had some good reputation. But Benjamin Franklin was the only first-rank scientist. And that won him multiple honors in Europe, particularly his experiments with what? Electricity. Now, he does not invent electricity. It had been around long before him, okay? But he did, his famous kite flying episode proving that lightning was electricity. We knew about electricity. It could be produced. It wasn't used in massive scale like we use today. But he did experiments with electricity, and you guys know about the kite, and he put the key on it. Yeah, okay, we got that. All right. But in addition to just being a scientist and kind of a philosopher with his Poor Richard's Almanac, he had a very practical mind. What does that mean? He was an inventor of practical things. What does that mean? They have a use that's very specific and useful. It's a good thing. So one of the things he invented was the bifocal, because he himself had, I'm not going to say bad vision, because most people wear bifocals when they get a little older. But a bifocal is simply glasses that have two different lenses. When you look through the top of them, you can see good far away. And then when you look through the bottom of them, as though you are reading, like reading glasses, it is a different lens which magnifies. And so you wouldn't have to constantly be changing glasses. Bifocals, invented by Benjamin Franklin. Another thing he invented, how did people heat their homes in the 1700s? They burn wood in what? A fireplace. You have some kind of stonework, and you put the wood in there, and it goes up into a chimney. Fireplaces are wildly inefficient because all the heat just simply escapes through the chimney. Not all the heat, but a significant portion. And so what he invents is called the Franklin stove. It's a fire. It's not a fireplace, but it's like a firebox. It's a stove. And this metal, it's made of cast iron. And the metal gets hot and it radiates the heat for hours. Do you guys have any experience with a stove like this? I used to have one in my old house. And you build a fire in there, and even if it goes out, it still radiates heat for a long time. So that much more efficient than a regular fireplace. And that was good. It's called the Franklin stove, by the way. All right. We mentioned that he did experiments with lightning, and he also began to affix these new devices to the tops of structures to divert electricity around the structure to prevent it from catching on fire. The lightning rod. Just a big metal stick you put at the tallest point. Lightning rod. Okay. But here's some actual pages of Poor Richard's Almanac. This is just basically a pamphlet that you could purchase or subscribe to. All right. Okay. Next. John Peter Zenger. Most Americans were generally too poor to buy a lot of books and read them. However, a few private libraries of fair size could be found, and especially among the clergy or rich families in the colonies. And there were printing presses, and these hand-operated printing presses could crank out pamphlets, leaflets, journals. And these pamphlets, leaflets, and journals were more widely read than books because they're cheap. A book was very expensive because it took a long time for the printer to print it all out. But a pamphlet, they print them out every day, and so they were much cheaper. So, especially on the eve of the Revolution, there were about 40 newspapers that operated in the 13 colonies. About 40 newspapers. Most of them were just weekly newspapers. You get the newspaper once a week, and it was a large single sheet of paper with very small print. That was the newspaper. Once a week, a piece of paper about this, about 2 feet, about a foot and a half, like a scroll almost, with a lot of print on it, and that was the newspaper. So newspapers became a very powerful agency for airing colonial grievances, things that made people mad, particularly things that the British did to make people mad. A celebrated legal case happened in 1734 to 1735, and it involved this gentleman here on the left named John Peter Zenger. He was a newspaper printer, and he is in New York. And his case reflects the give and take of the colonies when it came to the relationship with the crown. John Peter Zenger's newspaper published an article that really went against the royal governor of New York. They called him corrupt, called him bad leader, and just said terrible things about him. Now, this doesn't sound like a big deal to us because, you can pretty much say anything you want about a politician today, and either people will ignore you or it doesn't really matter because we have those freedoms. John Peter Zenger, it was unclear if he had those freedoms. So he was charged with seditious libel, Libel. Do you guys know what libel is? Do you guys know what slander is? It's where you say something about somebody and it is false and it harms their reputation. Libel is the same thing, only it's written. So libel is just written slander. It's false and it intentionally harms someone's reputation. That's what libel is. And that's what John Peter Zenger was charged with, libel. And so he was accused, he was hauled off to court where he was defended by an actual former indentured servant who became a lawyer. His name was Andrew Hamilton, not Alexander Hamilton, Andrew Hamilton. And Hamilton argued that that Zenger had printed the truth, but the royal chief justice wouldn't accept that. And so he instructed the jury not to consider whether it was true or false. Didn't matter. You weren't allowed to say anything about the royal governor. That's what the royal governor's perspective was. And Zenger's attorney Hamilton countered that the very liberty of both exposing people in power who are doing wrong was at stake. How do you think the jurors responded? What do you think they said? Well, if they were supporting the royal governor, would we probably be talking about it? They sided with Zenger. And Hamilton was able to sway the jury with his eloquence. And the jurors defied the judge and returned a verdict of not guilty. Even though, it was contrary to the laws that were on the books. So the John Peter Zenger decision is a banner achievement for freedom of the press, which is essentially, organized, purposeful freedom of speech. And for the health of democracy. You cannot have democracy without freedom of the press. It pointed the way to the kind of open public discussion that was required of a diverse society that America was becoming. You had to be able to speak your mind in a public forum. So, even though the decision made by the jury was contrary to the existing law, it helped to establish that, public officials could be prosecuted or could not. The law in the book said that public officials could not be, file libel lawsuits. And that becomes a precedent that gets set. You can't really be sued for something you say about a politician. You ever been to the grocery store and you see a National Enquirer there and it's like, Donald Trump has an affair with alien and has 3-headed baby. Have you seen stuff like that? Yeah. Is that true? Of course not. How are they allowed to say that kind of... Well, he's a politician. even though it's false, obviously, probably intended to hurt the man's reputation, you can still say it, as he's a public official, and you can pretty much say whatever you want as long as you're not, threatening their life. You can't say that. Okay, so, but the Zinger decision goes a long way toward aiding in the freedom of speech for America, freedom of the press. Right, pretty important. Questions on Peter Zinger, John Peter Zinger? All right, last little bit here. So, colonial life. Everyday life in the colonies for your average person, whether you're in New England or in the South or in the middle colonies, was pretty drab and tedious. For most people, the labor was hard and constant. Food was plentiful. If you were willing to work, you could eat well. Food was plentiful. Your diet was going to be monotonous, though. You're not going to get a lot of variety, but you're going to have a lot to eat. Americans probably ate more meat than any other nation on earth. A fact that is probably still true today. We eat a lot of meat. So if you were going hungry in the colonies, it's either you were lazy or you were sick. Because there was food to be had if you were willing to work for it. So basic comforts which were beginning to be taken for granted. There was, like we take this stuff for granted. The colonists had no running water, no plumbing, and there may not have been a single bathtub in all of America. Like a nice clawfoot bathtub in colonial America. Why? They're hard to get across the ocean, they're heavy, and they're very expensive. Do people bathe? Most people didn't. But how did some people get, what about wealthy people? Like wash basins. Like you bathe where you wash your clothes. Like in a wash tub. As opposed to a large bathtub, okay, which, has the insulation, the enamel, ceramic, okay. So, how do you heat your home? Or light your home, I should say. Candles. What else? Whale oil lamps. Meaning it's a lamp in which you take blubber from an animal called a whale, and it's flammable, and it will light your home. Needless to say, it provided a very faint, flickering illumination. What about garbage disposal? Where you put your garbage? You throw it to your pigs, your hogs, or buzzards. What if you live in a city? Throw it in the street and let the hogs that are in the street eat it. And the buzzards that are flying over the city. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Sounds like my neighborhood. Okay. Now, what do you do for fun? Oh, man, they did all kind of fun stuff. Kill people? Is that fun? For them? All right. Occasionally, the militia would gather. And it was called having a muster. It's just a gathering. Usually the militia muster would last several days, and it was basically, they would just drill. They would just practice marching. Doesn't that sound fun? Now, when they finished marching, there's usually going to be a significant amount of sitting around drinking, which has always been in America's favorite pastime. On the frontier, pleasure was often combined with work, meaning, hey, we're going to have a competition on who can sew the fastest. They called them spinning bees. Spinning bees. Or, hey, we're going to have a big party and we're going to build a house and you're invited. A house raising party. Or barn raising. Or quilting bee. Or we're going to see who can husk the most corn Ready, set, go. Or who can pare the most apples? Ready, set, go. And they would compete. And usually people were drinking, watching it. Or it was done in a church setting and people were praying and singing. Either way, this is what people are joining together, communing with one another, and work is combining with play. Funerals and weddings were often the most common opportunities for social gathering, both of which, regardless of where you were, involved the swilling of a great amount of liquor. Winter sports, very common in the North. The winter sports. Whereas in the South, things like playing cards, horse racing, cockfighting. You guys know what that is?
Get two chickens and throw them.
That's right. You get two roosters to fight each other to the death. And then, what do?
Whoever chicken wins gets.
You gamble on it. Yeah, you gamble on it. Dancing, fox hunting. That is if your religion allowed dancing. Other diversions like lotteries. There was lotteries. Now, I don't want you to think it's like Powerball. Their lotteries had a specific purpose. Like, we're going to build a bridge, and the bridge is expensive, so we're going to have a lottery, and the winner will get half, and the other half we're going to put toward building the bridge. So it was specific, local lotteries. Kind of like half and halves. Think of it like a half and half. But the other half went for public service projects. Stage plays became popular in the South, but were generally frowned upon in Quaker and Puritan colonies, and in some places were even forbidden by law. Yeah. Well, a lot of plays came from the Greeks and the Romans and involved nudity and people kissing each other, and that was not proper for public display. Holidays were celebrated all over the American colonies. But it really wasn't until large amounts of German immigrants came that Christmas was really celebrated in a modern American way. There were no Christmas trees in America until the German immigrants came, because that was a German tradition. Christmas trees. Thanksgiving came to be an American festival where it combined thanks to God and often an opportunity for jollification and gorging and guzzling alcohol. Now we just add watching football to that. Yeah. Okay. Basically the majority of the customs were British. They were British customs. But as time goes on, we begin to incorporate other cultures, customs, like we mentioned the Christmas tree. And that's what people did. Fatefully, all the colonies were separated from the seat of imperial authority. Everybody's 3,000 miles away from the British, separated by a vast ocean. And so, even though our shared culture and history and geography were common with the British, we're really, when we're creating this American culture, we're setting the stage for an entire group of people to be independent and to unite as one against a common enemy. And that is what our Unit 2 is all about. You guys have questions on today? So tomorrow's Friday, you have your outlines to work on. There's also an assignment that'll be due on Monday called your Period 1 activities. Period 1 activities. You just fill it out. When you turn it on Schoology, make sure you submit it as a PDF. And you have a test on Tuesday on Unit 1. So if you guys have questions at any point over the weekend or tomorrow, I will answer them as quick as I can. So have a great weekend. And I'll see you guys on Wednesday and everybody at home on Monday.